The day wrapped up with a keynote session by the influential urbanist Richard Florida. For anyone living in cities today, we're all living more or less in Florida's world. Years ago, he coined the somewhat controversial term creative class, where he predicted for cities to grow and attract young people, they needed to cater to creatives, artists, architects, writers, essentially what some would call hipsters. That involved everything from opening a cool bar to local coffee shops, setting up studio spaces and more. What he failed to predict was just how quickly this development would happen and the impact, such as gentrification, that it would have. His new book, The New Urban Crisis, which we featured here on The Urbanist earlier this year, is basically an apology for those predictions. And in Cork, he explained more.
If I made one error, it's this. It's that I entirely underpredicted the velocity, the speed and veracity with which the creative class and this back to the city movement would occur. I completely missed it. There is no way writing in the early 2000s I could have possibly imagined in my wildest dreams the force with which this which I believe is the greatest economic transformation the world has ever gone through. What we are living through now, this combination of creative economic activity, the knowledge revolution, and urbanization, this packing of knowledge and creative people in cities and urban areas, the world being not flat but spiky and clustered. This is the greatest economic transformation. It's bigger than the transformation Marx wrote about from agricultural feudalism to industry. It's bigger than the transformation of the early 20th century, which provoked 2 world wars. And it does not surprise me that we are seeing this unbelievable backlash. So here we are. Here we are. The urban-rural divide. The concentration of economic advantage in a small number of places. The falling behind of places outside. A new urban crisis, which is largely, not entirely, of success. A crisis of metropolitan centers who have attracted so much in the way of knowledge, so much in the way of investment, so much in the way of technology, so much in the way of the creative class, that they become increasingly unequal, increasingly separate and segregated, and increasingly gentrified and increasingly unaffordable.
So, is there anything that could be done about it? Or for cities like London, New York and Tokyo, is it just too late? Here's Richard again.
If we think about 2 scenarios, the bleak and the better, I think we're living in the bleak scenario. Look at what's happened in the United Kingdom with Brexit, with this great divide, with the anger of people in rural areas in the countryside at the success of London. Even worse, if I want to be bleakest of the bleak, a scenario I could have never imagined, a complete dysfunctional, narcissistic, D-list celebrity like Donald Trump could loom into the presidency of the most powerful nation on earth because of this divide. He really campaigned against tolerance, against diversity, against cosmopolitanism, against the urban elite on a campaign, I mean, I've said this, but it's like restore power to white male Americans. So, look, I think hopefully that's about as bleak as it can get. And what would look like a better scenario is that we would wake up in Britain, in the United States, in Europe, in the world, and say, look, we've had this few centuries old experiment in the nation state. It hasn't worked. We've had a couple of world wars. Now we have this nutty populism. Let's hand back power to people living in cities. And there's one statistic that I think is very telling. In the United States, where I come from, less than 20% of Americans have any level of trust and confidence in their national government. That's the presidency and the Congress. When you look at the states in the United States, it's about 50-50. I think it probably depends on if a Republican or a Democrat is in power. The other half say no. But when you get to the local community level, about 3/4 of Americans actually have great trust and confidence in the place they live. That's because you get to choose the place you live, you get to pick the kind of government you have, you get to pick the kind of people you want to live around. There, really, partisan ideology doesn't matter. People want to make a great city, Democrat, Republican, liberal, or conservative. So I think that's the better scenario. It's not euphoria, it's not utopia, but it's a world in which local cities and local communities have more power, and we can coexist, rural and urban, suburban, liberal, conservative, moderate. We all get to pick where we live, and instead of bashing each other in the heads, we pick where we want to live and we coexist with one another. I think in the next 20 years, that's a doable scenario. That better scenario is one we can get to.
And how do we stop the nice small places like Cork from becoming the big horrible places like London?
I think the new urban crisis, rightly or wrongly, snuck up on people. If you had talked to someone in London 20 years ago, you talked about somebody in New York when I was a boy, New York could be this place filled with creatives and young people and families, and they would have said, you're bananas, you know. New York is falling apart, it's a hellhole, it has high crime, and it's fiscally bankrupt. If you had said that Pittsburgh would come back, or Detroit, where my wife is from. I was just in Newark, New Jersey, my boyhood hometown, and it was a bustling thing downtown. People would have said, you're from the moon. So I think the urban renaissance snuck up on people. Now, a place like Newark, or a place like Detroit, or a place like Pittsburgh, or a place like Birmingham or Manchester, they've got a shot now. Philadelphia, at saying, we're going to try to address affordability, we're going to try to address class division, we're going to try to be more inclusive. I think for smaller places, they have to be, the word I would use is intentional. They would have to be intentional about regeneration, but intentional about being inclusive. And it can be done. It's hard to do it. You have to devote time and thought to being affordable, to maintaining affordability, to being a place where middle-class and blue-collar people can succeed. But you can do it, and if you put your mind to it. And I think the way I look at it is actually the hard problem was urban regeneration in the first place, bringing back our cities from the great suburban nowheres, really turning the tide and bringing back cities and urban areas. I know it sounds daunting, but it will be relatively easier to make those places more inclusive now that they have economies that function, that generate tax revenue, that create employment. And, you know, one thing we know is cities have record low unemployment. That's not saying much to the person who can't afford to live, but you can develop local social safety nets, not national ones, local social safety nets, higher minimum wages, better programs and policies for social or affordable housing. So I think inclusivity can be done. The way I look at it, the urban revitalization that we're living through took 2 or 3 decades, and it took a lot of hard work locally to do it. Making inclusive urban areas or inclusive rural areas or inclusive communities may take 2 or 3 decades, but we have to be intentional about it. If we're intentional about it, I think we can achieve it.
If there's a main takeaway from the Academy of Urbanism's Congress, it's that while there's still a long way to go, at least the conversation about rethinking how cities should be shaped has started. And in the years to come, smaller cities like Cork, that often live in the shadow of bigger urban areas, will play a crucial role in ensuring that city living doesn't become so unbearable it's a thing of the past.